I'm Sarah. Standing alone in my kitchen, the once familiar smell of simmering stew now feels like a mockery. The ladle lies on the floor, stew splattered across the tiles, and the sound still echoes in my ears like a gunshot. My son, Jake, just told me to get out of my own house, and the shock is like a cold wave washing over me. It all started that peaceful morning. The sky over Pinewood Valley had that soft pinkish glow right before sunrise, and the cold air coming through the kitchen window nipped at my cheeks. I poured my first cup of coffee and leaned on the counter, listening to the gentle mooing of the cows and the rustling of the chickens in their coop. After 40 years on this land, these sounds were as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. I heard the tires crunching on the gravel driveway. I could tell it was a city car long before the engine cut. Jake hadn't visited in months, but that morning, he stepped out of his sleek sedan like he owned the place. He smoothed his expensive suit, adjusted his tie, and glanced at the barn as if it was a foreign object. "Morning, Mom," he said as he came through the back door. "Big day, huh?" I handed him a mug and let him pour his own coffee. "It is," I replied. "You drive safe on the city roads." He shrugged. "You know how it is." He took a sip of the coffee and winced. "I forgot how strong your coffee is." I smiled. "That's because it has character." But he was already focused on his phone, swiping through emails, his eyes narrowed in concentration. The glow from the screen made the warm light in the room seem dim. Just then, Tom's truck rumbled into the yard. Tom was a hard-working man who helped me with the ranch. He knocked once and came in, his hat in hand, the brim frosted with the morning cold. He asked if I wanted the hay stacked in the south shed as usual, and I said yes. He greeted Jake politely and left to start his work. I noticed Jake watching him with a detached look, like someone from the city looking at a relic. "Sitting at the table," Jake said, "when everything's official, we might need to cut down on some expenses." "You pay Tom too much for what he does." I retorted, "He keeps this place running, and that's worth more than you think." He didn't argue, but the silence between us was heavy. We drove into town in the middle of the morning. The heater hummed, and the radio played softly. Jake talked about his office job, using words like investments, returns, and market trends that I barely understood. It seemed like the life I'd taught him on the ranch didn't matter to him anymore. Mr. Harris's office was above the local bookstore, just as it had been for decades. When we walked in, the bell above the door rang, and Mr. Harris came out from behind a stack of papers, his glasses perched on his nose. "Morning, Sarah," he said warmly. "Morning, Jake." He motioned us into the small conference room where the deed to the ranch was waiting on the table. Seeing my name beside Jake's on that paper made my throat tighten. I'd convinced myself for months that this was the right thing, passing on the family legacy. But in that moment, a flicker of doubt crossed my mind. Mr. Harris reviewed everything again, slower this time, the deed, the notarization, and the 3-day cooling-off period I'd requested. Jake shifted in his chair. "I don't see why we need to wait. Mom isn't going to change her mind," he said. Mr. Harris just looked at me, as if he could read my uncertainty. I forced a smile and said, "It's fine. Let's go ahead." I signed first. My hand shook, and the pen scratched on the paper. When I slid it over to Jake, he signed without even reading, like he was signing a receipt. Mr. Harris gathered the papers, put them in a folder, and locked them in his cabinet. "That's that. Come Friday afternoon, the ranch will be yours," he said. Jake clapped a hand on my shoulder, but it felt more like a gesture of ownership than affection. We crossed the street to the diner. The neon sign flickered above the door, and the smell of pancakes filled the air. Inside, Mrs. Jenkins greeted me with a wave and brought my usual coffee. Jake ordered a light breakfast, checked his watch a couple of times, and started talking about how owning the ranch would help him expand his business. When he mentioned refinancing the ranch, my fork paused halfway to my mouth. Refinance? I asked quietly. Just to leverage it a bit. You won't even notice, he said. For the first time that morning, the air in the diner felt thin. When we drove back to the ranch, Jake asked me to slow down near the house so he could take pictures. For insurance, he said, but as he walked ahead of me with his phone up, I had a sinking feeling that he was up to something. By late afternoon, the winter light was fading fast. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for the stew when I heard Jake's voice outside, sharp and excited. I stepped closer to the screen door. Through the glass, I saw him pacing the porch, phone pressed to his ear. Yeah, I'm here. The place is in great shape. We could list it for around $1,200,000, maybe more if the market stays good. My name goes on the deed this week, so we need to move fast. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, the knife hovering above the cutting board. He paused to listen, then laughed a cold laugh I didn't recognize. No, she won't be a problem. I'll get her settled in an apartment. She doesn't need this place. She can barely keep it together. I stepped away from the window, my hands gripping the counter. I tried to calm myself, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. But those words clung to me. When Jake came inside, he didn't notice the way I was watching him. He threw his coat on a chair, opened his laptop on the kitchen table, and started looking at mortgage rates. The stew simmered behind me, filling the room with warmth, but the air between us was icy. Jake, I said quietly. Why were you talking about selling the ranch? He didn't look up. I told you at lunch there are options. Selling might be one of them. I said, I thought the ranch meant something to you, even if you didn't want to live here. He finally glanced at me. It means opportunity. Opportunity to build a real future. I stared at him, trying to find the little boy who used to run around the ranch, who built tree houses and brought me wildflowers. But all I saw was a man in a hurry to get rid of his past. Move on where? I asked. I found an apartment complex in town. 1-bedroom units, all the amenities. You'll be comfortable there, he said. You've already looked at apartments? My voice cracked. Of course I have. You think I'd start this without a plan? I stepped closer to him. Jake, this is my home. He corrected me, it was your home. By Friday, it'll be mine. I can't let this place drag me down financially. I need to think long term. I reached for his arm. Jake, wait. Can we talk about this? He jerked away as if my touch burned him. This isn't up for debate. The room went silent. He walked back to the table, his boots leaving dust marks on the floor. When he turned around, his face was full of frustration. I don't want to argue. I'm tired, stressed, and sick of being treated like I don't know what I'm doing. I whispered, I never said you didn't. He snapped, you didn't have to. This whole act of surprise, asking questions you know the answers to, stop it. He took a deep breath and said, it'll be easier for both of us if you start packing. I want this transition to be clean. I repeated, transition? He exhaled sharply. Mom, don't make this harder. You can't stay here. My pulse raced. What do you mean I can't stay here? He glared at me. I mean, get out. Get out of my house. The words hit me like a punch. For a moment, my vision blurred, and the kitchen, my safe haven, suddenly felt strange. I bent to pick up the towel near the stove to stop my hands from shaking. When I stood up, he was already walking towards the front door, muttering about calls he needed to make. He left the door open, and the cold air rushed in. That night, I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, I heard Jake's words echoing in my head. By 8 o'clock the next morning, I knew I couldn't let things go on like this. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and picked up the phone. I hesitated for a long time before I called Mr. Harris. He answered on the second ring. Sarah, everything all right? No, I said. I need to know if the deed has been recorded yet. There was a pause. No, he said slowly. It won't be sent to the county office until tomorrow afternoon. Why do you ask? I closed my eyes. I want to cancel the transfer. He asked, Are you sure? I said, I'm sure. He said, All right. Come in this morning. We'll draft a revocation document. Since the transfer isn't complete, you're within your rights. I drove into town, trying not to think about how close I'd come to losing everything. Mr. Harris met me at the door with a sympathetic look. I signed the revocation with a steadier hand than the day before. He made copies, put one in an envelope, and gave it to me. You did what you felt was right yesterday, and you're doing what's right today, he said gently. When I drove back home, Jake's car was already there. He came out onto the porch as I got out of my truck. His face was tense and anxious. Mom, I need the updated paperwork. The potential buyer wants confirmation that everything's on track. I walked past him into the house, hanging my coat on the hook. He followed me, his steps urgent. Mom, did you hear me? I did, I said, taking the envelope from my purse. And this is the only paperwork you'll be getting. He snatched it from my hand and tore it open. His face turned pale as he read the page. What is this? He demanded. It's a revocation. I canceled the transfer, I said calmly. You can't do that. We signed the deed. It's done, he said, his voice cracking. It's not done until it's recorded, and it wasn't recorded, I replied. He started pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. Do you have any idea what you've just done? I've made commitments. I've taken a deposit. I interrupted softly, that was your mistake, not mine. He rounded on me, his eyes wild. You're sabotaging me. Why would you do this? I said, because you told me to get out of my own home. The words hung in the air between us. He flinched slightly, but his pride took over. This isn't over. I'll get a lawyer. I said, then get one. I'm done letting you dictate my future. He left without slamming the door, and the silence he left behind was deafening. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of strength. That afternoon, a young woman named Lily knocked on my door. She introduced herself as Jake's attorney. After reviewing the revocation, she sighed and turned to Jake, who was standing behind her, pale and angry. She's within her rights. There's no case here, Lily said gently. Jake's shoulders slumped. I watched the emotions of rage, disbelief, and humiliation flicker across his face as they left. The weeks that followed were tough. Jake stopped calling, and the silence was heavy. I went back to my ranch chores, fixed the fence with Tom, and sold eggs to the neighbors. But the pain of what had happened still lingered. Word spread through town quickly. Mrs. Thompson stopped by one day with a cake. She pretended she'd made too much. When I told her everything, she put her hand on mine and said, You protected what's yours. That's not being selfish. That's survival. About 3 months later, on a gray evening, a car I didn't recognize pulled up the driveway. I stepped onto the porch, wiping my hands on a dish towel. Jake climbed out slowly. He looked thinner, his clothes hanging loosely on him, and his eyes were hollow. Mom, he said, his voice breaking. I don't have anywhere else to go. He came closer but stopped at the bottom step, as if the house was a barrier he wasn't sure he could cross. He told me about losing his job, the lawsuit over the deposit, and how his friends had stopped talking to him. Then his voice cracked completely as he whispered, I messed everything up. Please let me stay. I'll work the ranch. I'll sleep in the barn. I just don't want to be alone. There was a time when I would have rushed to him, but something in me had changed that night he told me to get out. It wasn't anger or spite, just understanding. You're not alone, I said gently. But you can't stay here. He stared at me, his eyes filled with disbelief and then grief. I handed him a small envelope with $200 in it. Use it to get back on your feet. The rest is up to you. As he drove away, disappearing down the road, the wind blew across the pasture, carrying a mix of sadness and peace. For the first time in years, the ranch felt truly mine again, and I finally understood that protecting my home sometimes meant closing a door.